All right, so good afternoon, and thank you for having me at Canada Tech at Scale. So today I'm going to talk to you about scaling security compliance, but before I do, I want to tell you a story about my first Spartan race. And for those that don't know what a Spartan race is, I'll give you a visual. And so back in 2013, a group of friends of mine thought it would be a pretty good idea if we entered a Spartan race. And at the time, none of us really knew what it was, aside from we'd be running and there'd be some obstacles. And so we all signed up and we picked the 9 a.m. start time because we thought we should just be the first of the day, so let's do it. So that's what we did. The night before the event, I was pretty nervous. And what probably wasn't the best idea is I went on the internet and I started looking at everything I could find about the event. And what I was hoping to find out was, a sneak peek of an obstacle. But what I found out was something completely different. What I found out was that it was a tweet from Spartan Canada and it said, "Elite race at 9 a.m. Elite? 9 a.m.? And so, obviously, we didn't read the information very well. I went back to my email, I checked, and sure enough, we signed up for the Elite Spartan race. And so the next morning, we arrived early and we got to the site and we went through registration and we moved to the start line and there was a lot of Spartan yelling and cheering. And then we moved to, the gun went off and we started running. We started going up the mountain, and it really is a mountain, it's a ski hill. So we started going up the mountain and we were going at a pretty good pace. And we quickly found out that was not sustainable. And so our run slowed to a jog and then to a walk. And then we quickly dispersed. Now, the first obstacles I met, they were actually pretty easy. I had to climb over some tree logs, I had to go under some structures, but I could do them. They were actually something I could complete. The next few obstacles, they got a bit harder, but I could still complete them. They were a series of walls I had to climb, each higher than the previous. Now, when I got to the top of the mountain, I hit my first real challenge, and it looked kind of like this. It was a set of balancing bars, and I had to balance myself on these bars, and then using just my hands, I had to move myself the entire length of these bars, just like this person is doing in this picture. And so I got up there, and I went a couple of feet, and then I lost my grip, and I fell. And when I did, someone came up to me and said, "You have to do 30 burpees." And I said, "What?" So she stood there and she counted every single burpee I did. And I did all 30, and then I moved on. Now, the next real challenge I met looked like this. It was a rope climb. And so the rope for me was 16 feet suspended over a muddy pit. And so I had to climb this rope, and you can see in the picture, there's a bell at the top. And so you climb the rope, and then you hit the bell. And so I got up about 5 feet, and I'm holding on for dear life. And my arms start to burn, and I know I'm not going to be able to make it any further. And so I let go, and my feet hit the ground, and you guessed it, another 30 burpees. So I continue through the race, and I move to the bottom of the mountain. I complete the last few obstacles with pride, even though I had missed some along the way. I crossed the finish line with a big smile on my face, and for the first time all morning, I looked down, and I was covered in mud, cuts, and bruises. But it was all worth it, my first Spartan race in the books. And now, just to give you a snapshot of what I looked like, that is actually me in my Spartan race. So now, the objective of a Spartan race is to complete the race and complete all obstacles along the way. And for every obstacle you don't complete, you have to do 30 burpees. And 30 burpees really hurts. It adds about 5 minutes to your time. And so we can kind of think of security compliance as an obstacle course race. In security compliance, the obstacles are the safeguards that we put in place. These are the things we put in place to meet compliance with PCI DSS, SOC 2, Sarbanes-Oxley. And these safeguards, they can slow down our engineers and developers. They can get in the way and they can make it difficult to do the work. And in security compliance, the objective is to complete an audit and to show completeness of all the safeguards. And the people that are running the obstacle course of security compliance are the people in our organizations that are impacted by these safeguards. And so I think if we can reduce the friction that's in front of these obstacles and these safeguards, we can make it such that security compliance and Spartan races are something that we can all complete. So I think it's possible, and today I'm going to tell you how to develop security compliance in startups that preserves the speed of execution, yet is simple and seemingly invisible to engineers and developers. In Stephen Covey's book, The Speed of Trust, he talks about the trust formula. And he says that trust impacts two things. It impacts speed and it impacts cost. And when speed is really high, when trust is really high, speed is high and cost is low. And inversely, when trust is low, speed is low and cost is high. And he uses a good example of airline travel to explain this formula. The events of 9/11, they were really tragic, and society lost a great deal of trust in airline travel. And as a result, the speed of travel went down and the cost went up. The simple act of going to the airport to catch a flight, it now takes a lot more time. When I came from Ottawa to Toronto, I had to arrive at the airport early so that I could go through screening. Now, we can apply this trust formula to security compliance. In organizations where trust is high, we can trust that if we tell people how to do something, they will do the right thing. We don't have to put safeguards in front of them. We don't have to block them. We can let them be free and move fast. Now, without safeguards, we still need to get assertions. And we can do that. We can check people's actions. And if we trust that people are going to do something, and we tell them this is how you do it, and we check their actions, then if we find errors, we can let them know, and we can give them very clear instructions on how to fix it, and we can help them through that process. So this whole thing about trusting that people are going to do the right thing and verifying that they do it is called trust, but verify. And so the power of verification is that if anybody in your organization follows your company's practices, they never really have to hear about security compliance. Now, you're probably thinking, this is not always going to work, and that's true, it's not. There's going to be situations where trust is low or risk is high, and you're going to have to put safeguards in the way. And when we do that, we want to do it in a way that's very low friction. And so when we do that, it makes it such that all engineers and developers can overcome these safeguards. This is explained in a book I recently read called Fire Doesn't Innovate by Kip Boyle. He uses a graph to explain this. And so the graph is risk by security. And so when risk is really high, security is really low. And what we do is we add security. We want to draw that risk down. And when we do that, we get to a balance when security is just right. Now, there is some risk, but we're comfortable with that risk. Sometimes, though, what we do is we continue to add security. And when we do that, it creates a lot of friction, and it gets in the way of people getting things done. And so people get frustrated, and they start to find ways around your security. And that's not the objective here. The next time you're in a park, take a look around. You'll see there are paved paths and there are shortcuts. The paved paths are the paths that the people who designed the park, they thought that was the most optimal way to get around. But the shortcuts, those are the paths that the people that use the park, those are the paths that they felt were most optimal. And so in security compliance, if we put too many safeguards in place and we get people really frustrated, they will find shortcuts around our security compliance. And we don't want that to happen. Now, this sounds great, and you're probably thinking, how do I do this? But before you do it, we have to remember that we need a strong foundation of security in place first. And so before we go down the path of trust but verify, we want to have security first. And so we've seen many compliant companies become victims of security attacks. And the reason for that has been fractures in their foundation of security. And so therefore it's really important we put security first. Now this diagram shows you security versus compliance. Security is the big circle. It's all encompassing. Compliance, they're subcircles within security. They depend on security, but it's not the same thing. Security and compliance are different. If we revisit that airline example of 9/11, it was a security incident, and it showed that there was fractures in the foundation of security of airline travel. And the response to that event was that we put safeguards in place and we increased the security posture. And so it's incredibly important that we put security first. Now you're probably all wondering, like, what does that mean? Before we get there, let's think of it this way. Security is the protection and the culture of trust in our organization. And compliance is the verification of that protection and culture. And so how you do this and how companies do this, it's dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on the company's mission, the mandate, the size, where they're at in their growth. But let's take Shopify as an example. In the early days of Shopify, we were focused on building critical safeguards, things that were really tangible, things that we could do easily with a small team, things like implementing multi-factor authentication on all of our internal accounts, as well as putting in place configuration management across our platform, and implementing our HackerOne bug bounty program. And so you could say we were hyper-focused on building a strong foundation of security and a culture of trust. And so if we fast forward to Shopify of today, while we still carry forward some challenges like maintaining trust and access control, today's challenges are quite different. They're of a different scale and complexity. We can't solve them like we could solve multi-factor authentication. They're not as tangible. They require a lot more creative solutions. And so let's take an example, globalization. Shopify is a global company, and globalization is something that impacts the entire company. Now, part of globalization is compliance. And so the Shopify of yesterday, we focused on compliance for what we needed to do to be in business. The Shopify of today is entering into a whole new world of compliance to grow the business. It would not be possible for us to do that if we didn't put security first. Now, while we can't predict the future, we expect that tomorrow's challenges will be new again. And, we talk about security as a protection in the culture, and compliance is verification of that protection and culture. But we all know our companies change all the time. Our technology, our practices, our people. And so if our companies are changing, our security is changing, and our compliance is changing, and how do we track all that? Well, at Shopify, we found it very valuable to use documentation to describe compliance and to write that like code. This idea came in the early days of Shopify, when we were really small. And the person that was running security compliance, well, that person was running a lot of other things too. And so we needed a solution that was highly efficient and a solution that was very low friction. And so we chose to use documentation and to use GitHub. And so the thing that GitHub gave us is that we were now using the same tools as our developers and engineers. And so we were able to gain trust immediately. And when we needed an engineer to help us with an area of our compliance program, we needed them to review a document, they could leave whatever they were doing and come into our space without leaving their developer workspace. It was really low friction. The other thing that GitHub gave us was clarity of message. So as you probably all know, when you do anything in GitHub, you create a pull request, anybody watching your repo gets informed. People can see the change at the same time. They can go in, they can contribute, they can add comments, and all that information, it's tracked in GitHub for history. So if we want to go back and look in the future, we can do that. We have source of truth. Now, I'll give you an example. This is a document we created for our Sarbanes-Oxley program, and we needed somebody to review it, and so we put it up for review. And one of our developers came in and said, hey, you have a mistake there. And we said, thanks, we'll go fix that. It leads us to having really high integrity over our compliance program when we're able to use documentation in this way. I have another example where an analyst was working with an engineer for quite a while, a couple of hours, and they were going back and forth over a technical matter, and the compliance analyst was able to go back and write that information in a document in a really concise way, and I love this message. It's a little deflating to have almost 2 hours of verbal conversation reduced correctly and effectively into a few lines of documentation. So it shows you that using documentation, we can effectively capture information and scale information within our organization. Now, a compliance analyst once told me our audits are really low stress. And so when we start an audit, we give our auditor all of our documents. And this is all the documents we have for one compliance program, SOC 2. It's one of our newest compliance programs. And so we give the auditor these documents and they read them. And when they show up at our site, we spend 1 or 2 to 3 hours with them and not 2 to 3 days. It's a huge time savings. We're able to use documentation to control our audits. It removes the unknown and it makes it really low stress. Now, you could say that documentation for us is our compliance superpower. By using GitHub, our analysts develop developer and engineering empathy. They're struggling through similar challenges like merge conflicts on pull requests. And the other thing is that having engineers, analysts, and developers all on the same playing field, we immediately gain trust and we can maintain that trust really easily. Now, another one of our compliance superpowers is automation. So we talked about trust but verify, and we talked about how that allows us to move fast. It allows us to achieve security compliance without putting safeguards in the way of people, without slowing them down. And so to do verification, because verification is what keeps us compliant in that scenario, and to do that manually, it's really error-prone and time-consuming. But if we can use automation, we can make it simple, scalable, and we can get really creative in how we solve this problem. Let's take a few examples of what we did at Shopify. Certification Bot. Certification Bot is automation that we created about a year ago. We did this for our SOC 2 program. It monitors change management over our application, over our software. So when developers at Shopify make changes to the software, they have to get a peer review and they have to pass continuous integration testing. But we let them bypass those controls because emergencies happen and we want them to be able to fix things. And so what Certification Bot does is it monitors. And anytime one of those controls is bypassed, whether it's for good intention or not, Certification Bot creates another issue in a different GitHub repo. And it tags a developer and it says, hey, I saw you just did this. Can you please tell us why so we can understand the situation? And if you missed your peer review, can you go back and get it? It looks kind of like this. And so this is the GitHub issue that gets created. It explains the situation And at the bottom, it has a really simple checklist. So tell us why this situation occurred, and if you need to get review, please go get it. We give developers 5 days to do this. We deployed this for a small area. I shouldn't say small, for a fairly big size area of Shopify for SOC 2. We saw such great success from it that we decided we should put this elsewhere. It removes the friction of having to get approvals for changes. It makes it all very efficient. So we started rolling this out into new areas. And this is a conversation that Catherine and my team had with Burke. Burke's one of our software developers. And so we rolled it out into a new area, and Catherine said, hey, I just saw certification bot got triggered. And Burke said, yeah, I know. He probably knew he triggered it. But what he says at the end is really important. He says, I like it. It doesn't feel forced. It's kind and reasonable. And so this is a really good example of how we can build with automation compliance in a way that our developers and engineers, they really support it and embrace it. This is another example. So Camilo is one of our senior production engineering leaders, and he's a big fan of Certification Bot. And Camilo triggered it earlier this year in February. He was doing an emergency deploy, and he tweeted about it, and he uses the words automate, invisible, low touch. This is what we're talking about today and how we can scale security compliance. Now, another example we have is DoubleCheck. DoubleCheck is a bot that we recently created, again for SOC 2. And DoubleCheck monitors our hiring process. So at Shopify, we're hiring a lot, and we want our recruiters to move fast. But we do need to screen employees as they're coming in, and that's tied to one of our compliance programs. So DoubleCheck, it monitors Lever, our recruitment tool. And when it sees a candidate move from one stage to offer without reference checks in place, it pings them on Slack and says, hey, I just saw this happen. Can you take a look? It looks kind of like this. It's a simple Slack message. And since we've started running DoubleCheck, we've been able to ensure compliance with our hiring practices. The last example of verification is Minerva Bot. Minerva Bot monitors all things access control. And so in this case, I'm going to tell you about it was multi-factor authentication. Before I told you at early days Shopify, we put multi-factor authentication in place. Well, recently we deprecated SMS as an allowable second factor. And we told the company we're doing this. And then to ease the friction of that change, we turned Minerva Bot on. And Minerva Bot started pinging people as they tried to log in using SMS. And the message that it gave them was this. So it's pretty simple. It gives them a link to go find out more about how they can find something else, a different solution, and it tells them the Slack channel to go in. When we announced this to the company, it took us a month and a half, 2 months, before we could move everybody off SMS and then enforce the policy completely. And this was all done with low friction. Now, all those bots are super creative, and that's what this approach allows us to do. But we also talked about there's times where trust but verify it's not going to work, and we're going to need to put safeguards in place, and we should in those situations. And so we need to make them low friction. And so I'll share an example of this today. So we're staying on access control theme, Minerva. Minerva is our access control engine. And so with Minerva, when anybody logs into a resource that it is sitting in front of, it verifies a user, verifies a device, and then it provides controlled access. And so this is the first message the user gets when they try to access that resource. It says, yes, your device security is good, success. You're registered with our mobile device management system, and you pass all the security safeguards we would expect. The next message is security training. Anybody that joins Shopify must do security training. It's important. It tells them what we believe in for security and data protection. And so we check to make sure they've done it. And if they pass those 2 checks, we have a third warning that just says, why do you need access to this resource? We're not doing anything with that information to make an access decision. We're just trying to put a trust mindset into our employees. Maybe they don't need access. Maybe there's another way they can do whatever they were trying to do. But we like to ask them, and we'll record it for the purpose of improving our safeguard. Now, we talked about how automation allows us to scale that verification for trust but verify, and it allows us to build low friction safeguards. Also gives us a lot of great data. And that data gives us a window into the operations of our compliance program. It helps us to know, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Or in the case of this, are we sucking or not sucking? And so that information is critical for us to improve compliance, but also it allows us to be very agile. So when somebody comes to us and says, how long is it going to take you to get to the next compliant program? We can say, let's go back and look at our data. Let's look at our dashboards. Let's see what the data tells us, and we'll give you a reliable answer. And so automation is really helping to keep us honest in security compliance. And it helps us prepare for our audits. Audits, they're the necessary evil of security compliance. It's kind of like going to the dentist. None of us like going to the dentist, but we all have to go from time to time. And when we go, we brush our teeth, we floss, we do all these things to prepare because we want to see a healthy checkup. Well, with security compliance and at Shopify, we want to focus on long-term health. We don't want to be rushing before the auditor shows up. And so data really allows us to be able to do that. Now, I think we could make security compliance really simple with one small mindset shift. Instead of using safeguards to block us from achieving our purpose, let's use safeguards to support our purpose. Now, when I met the bars and the rope in 2013, when I did my first Spartan race, the friction, it was too high. I couldn't overcome those obstacles. And I had nobody with me to say, this is how you do it, and oh, you made a mistake, but let me show you how to fix that, and you can try again. And it felt really bad, and I had to do a lot of burpees, and that really hurt. But I went on to do more obstacle course races, and the results were dramatically different. I powered through those bars and those ropes. And the reason is I had a guide on course with me, and that was called experience and knowledge. You see, after I met those obstacles the first time around, I researched how to do them. I found out other techniques. I found out the best path that I could overcome them. And my experience taught me that I needed a lot of practice. And I did that. I practiced, and I got better. And I was able to figure out ways to lower the friction so that I could make those obstacles something I could complete. Now, in security compliance, if we take a high trust approach to compliance, we don't have to put safeguards in place everywhere. And we can let people move fast. We can preserve the speed of execution. And if we put security first, we can have confidence in our foundation of security. And if we leverage documentation to describe our compliance programs and we write it like code, we can empower our audits. We can make decisions really quickly, and we can move fast. And if we use automation for things like verification and low friction safeguards, we can achieve simplicity, invisibility, and we can be really creative in how we solve these problems. So I hope you would agree by now that it is possible to develop security compliance in startups that preserves the speed of execution, yet is simple and seemingly invisible to engineers and developers. Thank you.
All right, questions? Anyone? Okay. Over here.
Thank you for the informative talk. Okay. So I guess my question is around, as companies are moving towards DevOps, we are having developers and ops are in the same team. But one thing that we are currently encountering in my organization is our developers saying, hey, I need access to this database. And my ops guy is saying, it's a high-risk database. We are not going to provide access to it. So it's this constant struggle of needing access versus not giving access. So how do you make your people who manage these resources, especially your ops teams, to be like risk comfortable? And how do you make your developers to be like risk aware? Like what is the perfect trade-off? And how do you build that within your teams?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this comes to the culture of trust that you build in your organizations. And so, at Shopify, we default to open internally. We're very transparent internally with our employees. We tell them why we make the decisions we make, and if we think something is too risky, we let them know why it's too risky. It's not a big secret. They understand how we're making our decisions. If somebody needs access to something and they really do need it to get their job done, then we want to give them access to it. We don't want to prevent them. It slows them down. But what we do want to make sure is that we have incredibly good monitoring in place, and we want to make sure we have strong reactive controls. And so it's a concept of not blocking, but being very quick to react and reducing that window of risk down to a level that you and the rest of your organization feels incredibly comfortable with. And so I think that would be what I would say is, trying to be very open, trying to be transparent with your information, building a culture of trust, and then not being afraid to allow people to have access if they truly need it. I mean, we all want to move forward, but making sure when you do that, you have a safety net. So you're able to react, you're able to collect data, and you're able to know if something went wrong as a result of that.
Hi. It was great information you gave. How big is the team that you have working on creating and maintaining the tooling and the automation that you're providing for the rest of the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our teams are kind of fluid. Like, we all work very closely and we work together. So it's not like a direct black and white, this team designs it, this team builds it, this team runs it. But I would say overall we have probably around, I'm going to say 20, 25 people that are focused on like either building compliance at Shopify, so building the programs and running the programs, and then designing these safeguards and these mechanisms to monitor or verify. And then we lean on some of our other teams in trust to be able to make sure they're running. So teams like our internal security team is a big help in this area.
You mentioned HackerOne. I wonder if, do you guys still do that type, like, do you still work with them? Do you do pen tests internally? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, so HackerOne is still a very healthy and successful program for us. We spend a lot of time with those hackers and we treat them really well because it's a great source of information for us. So that is still very strong and alive. We also do external pen tests. That's something that is required based on the business we're in, but it's also just a healthy thing to do. We also run regular vulnerability scans as well, so we don't just have one thing we rely on. It's a combination of assessments that we use to be able to get confidence.
So I love some of the automation you've put in place. We all have limited cognitive load and we saw earlier some of the costs of waste and interruption and so on. Do you measure at all sort of the impact of that automation on developer productivity?
Yeah, so that is something that we're thinking of doing. We haven't really cracked the nut fully on that one, but definitely, like, we want to put automation in place, but we want to put smart automation in place. And so Shopify is, we use Slack quite a bit, and so that's why we use Slack and GitHub quite a bit. So that's why a lot of our automation is using existing tools that people are already in and day out. But we are thinking about starting to look at how much distraction does it create versus how much value does it give us. It's a good question.
I was wondering if you could talk about Shopify's incident management program and how those learnings feed back into the work that everybody does every day?
Yeah, so Shopify has a strong incident management practice in place, and it's not just the security team. So this dates back to the early days of Shopify. When an incident occurs, we're notified, but there's a strong group of people that are helping to solve the problem. And so there's accountability within the individual development teams and engineering teams that if you build something, you maintain it. And if it breaks, then we have many on-call schedules in place to make sure we have the right people available to respond. We do have a defined role for incident response though, and that is really about making sure that we're coordinating efforts effectively, making sure that we're taking care of the incident as fast as we can, but also making sure that we're looking at our incidences in a forward-thinking way. So why did something occur? Doing RCAs, understanding actions that come out of it, and making sure that those actions are closed off. And we're now starting to think even a little bit further about how do we now start to make our applications incident ready in the sense of let's start to integrate incident response into the developer lifecycle. Now, feeding things back, incident management, we work very much in the open. It's very transparent inside at least the trust team. And so we communicate effectively. If something comes up and there's something that we can do to make a change quickly and to mitigate in a very fast way, we do. Or it feeds into how we can improve our safeguards moving forward.